Hello, thank you for being part of Wyatt's podcast. I am so glad and honored that you're part of this podcast. I would love to start with introductions. Could you share more about you?
Sure. Hi, my name's Clare Murray. I am most pressingly, most perhaps interestingly in this podcast, I run a small nonprofit art museum bus for children and youth in my home state of Connecticut. I'm also an artist, art thinker, doctoral candidate, finishing up my dissertation focused on a museum project down in Paraguay that has been circling around the idea of really considering children as a key audience group.
That's amazing. And I saw photos of the museum, like the buses, and I was like, I got so excited and I wish like I could interact with that. And I'm curious, before we jump into more of your work, I'm curious like how did this interest started for you, like with like all children and like education and creativity, like how did that come into play for you?
Yeah, early childhood was never something I thought I would go into, Nanvi. In undergrad, studied economics. I studied Latin American studies. I went on to do, cultural economics work. But along the way, even in my undergrad, I need to be in museums for my well-being. And I was really fortunate in my undergrad experience to have an internship at my college art museum. I had two incredible mentors at the time who said, Claire, we have to start an early childhood program. We have grant funding for this. We need to do this. So the three of us together had to create something out of nothing. And in that hands-on, really experiential, learn by doing kind of approach, I found something special about museums that I hadn't known before, and that is the way in which that museums come alive when children are in them and when children are making meaning with them. And so fast forward, I obviously had a lot of other academic and intellectual interests, and I continue to. But museums has been this piece that, even as my research has continued to evolve from more quantitative methods to totally qualitative, um, looking at the ways in which our museum programming highlight student voices, consider children's proclivities, all of that has become more and more fascinating to me. And so in 2019, I had a group of folks actually corresponding when I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and learning some background important information about how to build a business plan. I had the right team with me to say, we need to do this. We need to ensure that all children in our home state of Connecticut have access to the myriad benefits of early art museum-based learning. So a multitude of things has led me that way, and I surely also should not discount my own early childhood and the experiences that I had there that, you know, as we all know, have been so formative in the ways in which I and all of us approach our careers and our purposes.
Yeah, no, that's so beautiful. And I would love to know because it's such a unique way when I was looking at like bringing museum to children which might not have the access otherwise or like might not like be able to travel to other places. So I think bringing this like idea of access to arts and creativity is so key and important here. And I would love to hear more about you, like how did that kind of evolve for you and what do you think like these high quality museum experiences support children and like what have been your experiences with families, communities and children?
Yeah, so I'm hearing two questions. The
Yeah.
first one I'll answer about access and why the bus. Yeah,
Yeah.
so Connecticut, just to paint a picture, is a small state, but a really diverse state and a really representative state in a lot of ways of our country. You can be in one town, you can go 20 minutes to another town, and access to the arts can be a entire 180, corresponding with all sorts of other socioeconomic um, indicators. The other piece, though, in Connecticut is that you can go from one corner to the other. You can go from hyper urban to really rural. And so, in thinking about, we have really wonderful museum resources in Connecticut. We have New York right next door. We have Massachusetts. We're in a beautiful location. But there are these pockets that to get to a physical brick and mortar museum is very difficult, even in our urban locations, amidst this push towards standardization, schools aren't always apt to say, yes, we need to take a museum field trip today. We recognize the value that's going to have multiplicative effects across all sorts of different disciplines, but also just for the student as a whole child. So Connecticut and access the bus became important as a vehicle for making sure that the benefits of museum-based learning could reach all children, and schools could have no qualms about barriers to entry. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, that's that's interesting to know because I think a lot I'm sure like a lot of places, like museums are not accessible to all parts for like different reasons, not just geographic, but there's also a lot of other reasons which kind of impact having an understanding and conversation with museums. So yeah, I think I agree to that for sure. And sorry, yeah. I think the next question was definitely for the quality part of education systems and what have you observed like bringing these experiences have worked and have been with children and families and communities.
Yeah. So from the outset, Nanvi, part of the cARTie model, the cARTie curriculum, the cARTie approach has been that we want to build partnerships with our school partners, with our community partners, and we don't just want to do a one-off. There's always a time and a place for a one-off. Seeing a museum and experiencing a museum once is better than never. But the key part of our work that bridges early childhood and museum education is that we're building relationships, we're building trust, and not just between people, not just between us as educators and children as children, and all of us as learners, but also as the environment, the museum space is a trusted friend, a trusted resource for learning. So in terms of quality, a key pillar of our work from the outset has always been going to our school partners, going to our community partners many times. And especially with the school partners, one visit being able to build upon the next and scaffolding toward higher order thinking. All of our conversations aboard the bus are foregrounded with open-ended questions. We want to see and make meaning together and practice those critical skills in the 21st century of listening, of explaining, expressing, and collaborating, and rationalizing and reasoning. And so in a space that it has foundation of trust, has foundation of real strong connection, then we can layer on these open-ended questions, these provocations with the space, with different art materials, and children can go forth in practicing and building those skills, those dispositions to then demonstrate quality in and forth the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, like, just to understand, like, also, like, why did you feel the urgent need to bring these art experiences to the children? Like, yes, one part is a museum as an access, but you also talk about the bigger part of like this continuous scaffolding with provocations, with questions, open-ended, and like how that kind of is a whole understanding and relevance of this work. So I'm curious to know, like, what was the need which you saw in like school settings or talking to children, people, and you saw that, okay, I need to bring this more arts and more artful experiences to the kids.
Yeah, I think I'm talking to a like-minded individual here. Art is a way in which we make meaning. The arts, the 100 languages, that is for children a way in which memories are also built for long-term learning. And so in cARTie, what we're doing is not just, museum buses here, party. What we're doing is actually thinking about how we can use art-based communication to reinforce certain learning patterns, certain thinking patterns. And that's something that requires time, it requires space, it requires individuals who have that certain philosophy of education. And so when we package that together and bring that to schools that have stresses upon them, burdens upon them to be meeting XYZ other requirements, there's a complementary relationship that can emerge there. And so that is the model, the plan, the thinking there.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, what kind of conversations and what you saw with children's work or parents' work, which kind of stayed with you and you wanted to like continue this work as well. Like, I'm curious if you have any, remember any conversations from doing this work.
Yeah, there's last year so every year we have a different annual exhibition, and it's a juried art exhibition of student art is another key piece of our model, where it's Connecticut middle and high schoolers who are emerging student artists who are going to go on potentially likely to art school and careers in the arts. And they want a space to showcase their art and then thereby also be, role models for younger students. And so last year in that juried art exhibition that, by the way, we co-curate with children and families, there was one piece that was called The Little Boy Who Loves Green. And it was a piece that young children could really see themselves represented in, reflected in. They could connect with the artist herself. They could also, though, notice that this was a head-on portrait with bright textural green behind this individual, this little boy who loves green. And there was an opportunity for us to send home a postcard to families after one of our visits. And so and we invited families to let us know, how's your child talking about cARTie at home? And the responses that we got back talked about seeing representation, talked about the minute details of our bus. Yeah, we have these. I mean, I love them, but it's a minute detail, these log cushions that look like logs, right? Bringing them outside in. And it's they put them to the side and kids pull them out. But the fact that there were these little details that children were talking about at home, that not only maybe were we talking about the little boy who loves green, but also the aesthetic experience of being in a space set up for children. And it was really designed with children. And so to hear and see those certain elements picked up upon is really validating.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like it also makes me think about the pedagogy and like how have you thought about like how like this supports children to like look, notice, make meaning? Like how does honoring their thinking? Like how have you thought about like kind of bringing this like pedagogical lens with these experiences and like what is something which you believe in when you create this?
Well, so first and foremost, our work begins with a vision of the child as totally capable, totally incredible as an artist who makes meaning through playful, heartful, mindful, body-based movement and learning and making. And so starting from that foundation, the pedagogy that we work with is very much inspired by the Reggio Emilia approach, is very much inspired by Project Zero's artful thinking routines, is very much inspired by Project Zero's studio habits of mind, VTS, the list can go forward. But what we bring together is an approach that is flexible, that adapts to any child and any group of children. We follow what we notice in their needs and their interests, and then we try and match and align with what they're gravitating toward in the environment that day, and how can we lean into that interest and then go forward with real real curiosity, real interest in what the children are noticing, and in so doing, open up them to going forward and noticing that they have some really important contributions that then we're not just going to be verbally talking about, we're also going to have a big sheet of paper that covers our whole floor up, and we'll be sitting around it and we'll be taking note and making visible all of our thinking. And it's not just, one child's thinking, it's everyone's thinking, and that how those thinking patterns intersect and how they connect and how they make this larger image and vision of what's going on. So that's our pedagogy in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that because I'm also curious to know like what kind of, like quote unquote, like skill development have you seen over the periods when children are scaffolded with these artful experiences? Because, I'm a bias and I'm for all arts for our arts person, but I'm because when I'm also like talking to people who might not understand that, I'm always like trying to bring in different ways of like how do I support and looking at cognitive development which is happening, executive functioning, and throughout age groups. And I'm curious to know like what have been your experiences with that been?
Yeah, evaluation is a big piece for us, not only because we're a small nonprofit run especially on foundation dollars, and we have a lot of reports that go always back out. Part of our evaluation, we hear from students, we hear from teachers, we hear from administrators. And for periods of time, we have asked, from the start of the year toward the end of the year, can we see a difference in a teacher's sense for how well their students are implementing critical thinking?
Yeah.
And we can ask the same about creativity. And that's a difficult question to ask, quite frankly, because there's a skew by the end of the year. Oh my gosh, it's off the charts. So we're still iterating, and thank goodness we do have evaluation as a core tenet of our work, and still trying to figure out, can we use Leuven's scale of well-being and involvement
Mm.
and engagement a little bit more? Still, there's a subjective sense to that, but can we continue to iterate in our evaluation tools to really make sense of the impact, not just from the beginning of the school year to the end, but also, especially because cARTie is now entering into our sixth year or seventh year, really. How do we think about the longitudinal impact? And when we see a child for the first time and they are 3 years old, and then we see them when they're 4 and they're 5 and they're 6 and they're 7, and then they go forth, how is their critical thinking when they're
Yeah.
12 years old? How is it when they're 20? Where are they going in their next career stages?
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. And I love that you say that because I'm also very interested in this documentation piece and like how do we show process which really kind of values what they're learning and thinking and not just looking at the outcome but also like looking at the documentation and how this is kind of goes on as they grow up and like how this supports them. But I feel like it's a very tricky space to be because everybody's looking for numbers rather than, like qualitative, that much like anecdotal sort of documentation. So, yeah, no, that is, I think all of us are retreating into that space. And like talking more about this, like I would love to know what more about like the misconceptions have you faced around the arts and like how have your language kind of evolved around looking at arts and like why we need the arts too.
Well, I think your question right there, it brings me back to that piece around documentation. Every visit that we do, we foreground sitting together and taking collaborative notes and documenting the lessons that are being learned and the conversations and the ways in which those conversations are unfolding. And yeah, I will admit that those big sheets of paper sometimes look like a giant web and mess, maybe, let's say. But we roll them up and we hand those to those teachers and we expect that they're going to use that back in their classroom. Put it somewhere, just make that learning visible. This is a documentation in action. We certainly can and we have gone back and then refined that into a document that can then be shared with families that can be more beautifully represented to children, to other school community members as well. So I would say big conception is that it is a mess, that documentation piece doesn't matter. I saw it just recently in my doctoral dissertation research work down in Paraguay. Doing documentation work still in different contexts doesn't land, doesn't resonate. What's the point? But I will say with our work with cARTie, what we have managed to do is in that scaffolding of visits toward the end of each school year, we have built in the growth toward a project that is a school-wide mural. And it's a mural that all the students are going to practice their collaboration skills, paint side by side, also have their own individual contributions that we layer over top. And it's a school-wide mural that documents their lessons learned, their key takeaways from their time with cARTie that year. For instance, this year, the exhibition we have on view is all about the many ways of seeing and thinking, that there is no one way to see, no one way to think, that there are many ways of seeing and thinking, and the works of art allow students that entry point into thinking that way and holding space for that worldview. And I'm really proud and excited to see the ways in which our school partners and then by extension community partners see these murals and take children's learning seriously. Like that they have turned this year of museum visits of arts-based learning into big, bold, beautiful, collaborative, perfectly imperfect pieces that communicate a message that us as adults also really need to learn. So I would say being able to shift the narrative around documentation is actually a misconception that we're still working, but we're still pushing. And I think art has the power to help us push that.
No, yeah, I love that. And I'm curious to like now talk a little bit about like the teachers, like who kind of come to this program and like how have you seen or seen kind of the subtle shifts which maybe the teachers have gone through looking at children exploring and immersing themselves in the arts? Like, have you had any conversations? Like maybe they used, a technique in their classrooms and other subjects. Like I feel like, the way we do the arts could be very much integrated in all parts of the subjects and schools. I'm curious, like if you had those conversations around.
It is often that we're with a school teacher while we're on the bus,
Yeah.
and a school teacher will say, "Don't touch that," and a school teacher will scream out, "Sit down, quiet, everyone, focus here." And those are really, that's behavior management, but it's also an opportunity for us then to model, we're in this space. This is your children's art museum. This is their art museum. And for them to take ownership, to take agency, we need to lean into the challenge that they may be facing right now, that there's a lot to look at, a lot to do, and how can we navigate this together? And I will say the subtle ways in which we can model a question as opposed to great starfish you've drawn, as opposed to that, we might say, tell me about what you're working on. And that subtle shift that we are constantly modeling does leave an impact, does leave an imprint. And we see it in some of the testimonials from teachers in the way that our approach to, I think the teachers quoted saying, cARTie educator, they will sit elbow to elbow on the floor with a child working through the problem that they've set forth. And that approach has been it has imbued some new values into the school culture, and that's awesome.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I think I'm so glad that you mentioned modeling because I feel like sometimes modeling takes a long way than somebody telling them to do this way or that way, especially with coaching and training teachers, I feel. And I think this modeling plays such a big role into that impact. And like I also like I'm curious to know like what are your hopes? Like what kind of ripple effects do you imagine with cARTie or just like arts and education you kind of imagine, envision kind of taking forward and like what are the things which kind of keeps you grounded into this work too?
I hope that the generation of children we're working with go forward in their lives and feel confident stepping into any museum space, any cultural institution, any civic space, knowing that they have a place there, they have a
Yeah.
voice there, they need to be there.
Yeah.
I also hope that this generation of children we're working with will go forth and know that they can think critically, they can see something from many different sides, many different perspectives. They can work collaboratively. They can exercise emotional intelligence. And using all of that, they can become the change makers we need in our society. I also hope that the generation we're working with goes forth and knows that they can use art as a tool for communication, that art does not need to be undervalued. Art, in fact, is universal. And the many ways of art, the many different manifestations of art, I would hope that all three of those big aspirations can one day come true.
If we have to like talk about like kind of to summarize what arts gives us, like what is the superpower sort of like have you seen like arts or museum exhibitions kind of teach us with like about being human and belonging and like how giving voice and agency to the children and adults like how what you would you say to that?
Yeah, Susan Magsamen and Ivy Ross touch on this in Your Brain on Art. When arts first came to be, it was literally a tool for community. It was a tool to document and demonstrate community. And so I think for me, art is community. I think it's also individual in community. It's a way of saying, I am who I am, we are who we are. And I think that art can become even more when we start from that
I would
foundation.
love to know like what are the questions or what are the key curiosities you are sitting with right now around this space?
A big thing on my mind is leadership styles and how do we go forth and grow, and what leadership styles can I continue developing?
Yeah, no, I think that's very curious also because it makes me think about like arts leadership is plays such a big role in having this impact because I mean there's one part is like education, pedagogy and the outcomes, but this is also a big part of like how do we advocate for the arts and like how do we bring into spaces which might not understand fully what arts can give us. So I love that like this is like a journey you are going on to. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was amazing.